Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Excited to have all of you here with us. Today, we're going to be talking about how to build a culture of equality in tech. So we have an exciting panel. We're going to jump right in because we have quite a bit to cover. But just thank you all again for being here. So before we dive in, I just have a few quick items I want to cover. Logistics. So we already have questions lined up for that we're really excited to ask our panelists. And so if you do have questions for the panelists or about the Equality in Tech report that we'll be speaking about today, or even about diversity, equity, inclusion in general, and those come up during the webinar, please do submit them using the control panel, and we'll make sure that we answer them in posts on the DICE blog over the next week. So next, today's webinar will be available on demand after the live session, and we'll send you a link to the recording via email. So please keep an eye out for that. Finally, there's a post-webinar survey that we'll send to you. We would really love your feedback, and we learn a lot from those and make sure we can improve and make sure we're getting the most relevant content out there. So please do fill that out. Finally, I just want to share that, like many of you, I'm working remotely today, and then our other panelists, all of us are in different locations. I'm confident that everything should run smoothly, but please just bear with us if we have any technical difficulties today. So for the agenda today, we'll walk through a brief introduction to the report, Quality in Tech report, and talk about some key trends, and then we'll highlight our amazing panelists. I'm so excited to introduce them to you, and then we'll jump into our panel discussion. So starting with the report itself. So we released DICE's first ever Equality in Tech report on March 23rd. And the report presents perspectives from technology professionals on racial and gender equality in the tech world and within their organizations. So the URL is up here at the top, but we'll also put that in the webinar chat for you. The report is not gated at all, so we just really wanted to get this data in front of as many people as possible. Just overview in the report, it's based on responses from more than 9,000 technologists surveyed in the fourth quarter of last year. And importantly, the mission for the report is to raise awareness around social inequality in tech, including gender and racial inequality and discrimination. So if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, the report in detail, we hope that you will. Like I said, it's free and simple to access. So jumping into some of the responses, I'm really just going to cover it at a super high level because I really want to get into the panel discussion. But starting with responses on a question about gender equality. So when respondents were asked if they'd experienced gender discrimination in the tech workplace, more than half of technologists identifying as women, that's 57% to be exact, reported that they have experienced some form of gender discrimination. 10% of technologists identifying as men said the same. What I want to say about this is that it's also worth noting that gender discrimination is likely underreported in the workplace, as many of those who experience it are afraid that speaking out could have a negative impact on their performance review or their career. It could also impact what both men and women experience and witness when it comes to discrimination within their organizations. So I think important to note there. So next, with that in mind, the report shows the data on the perception of gender inequality, and it really tells a similar story. And you're going to see the trends here throughout the data. Women are vastly more likely to believe that gender inequality occurs in the tech industry. In fact, 58% of technologist respondents who identified as women stated that they believe discrimination occurs frequently or very frequently, and that's in comparison to 31% of men. So the report also looked at racial inequality as well. It's split into two parts. If you haven't had a chance to take a look, more than half of Black technologist respondents, so 55%, believe that racial inequality occurs frequently or very frequently in the tech industry. This is the highest of any group in the survey. That's followed by Hispanic, Latino, or Latina respondents at 39%, Asian Pacific Islander respondents at 31%, white respondents at 30%, and Asian Indian respondents at 22%. When it comes to technologists who've experienced racial discrimination, Black respondents at 48% were more likely to have experienced racial discrimination than all other groups. This is followed by Hispanic, Latino, and Latina respondents at 30%, Asian Pacific Islander respondents at 25%, Asian Indian respondents at 23%, and then white respondents at 9%. So finally, in just looking at the intro to the data, technologists generally assign importance to their organization making policy changes that support anti-racist and inclusion movements, though at significantly different rates depending on race, as you can see here. 71% of Black respondents said these changes were either extremely or moderately important, the highest level of any group, And then this was followed by Asian Indians at respondents at 57%, Hispanic, Latino, and Latina at respondents at 50%, Asian Pacific Islander at 48%, and then white respondents at 43%. So one thing to say here is that while the data is showing it shows varying levels of importance placed on these types of policy changes, creating any lasting change, and I know our panelists will talk about that, means that these policies have to be perceived as important by all employees and members of leadership in an organization, not just those who are most impacted. So just in looking at these highlights from the data, there's so much more to unpack in the report. I promise I'll stop pitching the report, but you can see that we still have so much work to do as an industry. And so as DICE CEO Art Zaley put it in his message within the report, we must do better. And so in this webinar today, I think we're looking at the questions that so many organizations are asking now is the how. What's the path forward to closing these gaps? How do we build a more diverse workforce in a healthy way, outside of just setting and meeting quotas? And what changes should we make to be successful in making progress over the long term? And what can be done right now? So with that in mind, turn my camera on here. I am extremely honored to have the opportunity to moderate today's panel discussion featuring two incredible experts in the diversity, equity, inclusion space. And I've just loved getting to know both of them through this process. So they're here to help us answer really critical questions facing organizations. So without further ado, I want to ask them to introduce themselves. So we'll start with Jackie Ferguson. Can you tell us a little bit about you and the diversity movement?
Sure, Dan. Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be sharing time with you all today. I'm Jackie Ferguson. I like to say that I was born into this diversity work, being raised in a multiracial, multi-generational, multi-regional family, blue collar, white collar. So seeing the world through different lenses of experience is innate to me, and those courageous conversations are just part of how I grew up. And then having worked in marketing, HR, and business operations across many industry verticals, and having earned the designation of Certified Diversity Executive, this work is personal and also, a professional passion. I'm a contributor to publications including Forbes, Almanac, and some others, and I've done speaking engagements around the US, mostly from the comfort of my bedroom office. I'm sure many of you are experiencing the same with your slippers on today. I'm the co-founder and head of content and programming for the Diversity Movement. The Diversity Movement is a data-focused, technology-driven organization that focuses on improving business outcomes with a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. And it's so good to be here with you today.
Thank you so much, Jackie. It is our pleasure to have you. So we're so excited for the discussion today. And let's go over to Sienna Brown from PowerToFly.
Awesome, and thank you so much for having us, Dan and Jackie. I'm really excited to share the stage with you. So my name is Sienna Brown, and I'm the Senior Manager of Global DEI Strategy at PowerToFly. And at PowerToFly, our focus is really how can we uplift and fast track economic equality through giving opportunities for underrepresented talent to connect with companies that care. And so similarly to Jackie, I love that you shared a little bit about your personal story, and I definitely resonate with that because I've always grown up as being in the in-betweens, right? And I think that when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's really being able to say, how can we create a space where everyone feels like they have a seat at the table? And so not just have a seat at the table, but we'll talk about that a little bit more, but really being able to say, how can we show up as our most authentic selves no matter where we are? So really looking forward to this conversation today and excited to share more with you all.
Thank you so much, Sienna. We're so happy you're here. I'm Dan Martin. I'm a Senior Director of Content and PR at DICE, which is a DHI group brand. For those of you who have not been with us for our webinar series before, DICE is a dynamic career marketplace for technology professionals, managing over 9 million profiles in the United States. And the platform is designed to help technology professionals manage their careers and helps employers and recruiters connect with highly skilled tech talent. We like to say that DICE is where tech connects. So with that, let's move into our panel discussion. So, and yeah, here we go. Not sharing the presentation anymore. I hope we didn't lose. Oh, there's Sienna. Okay, so before we dig into the how, I think it's really worth it to start looking at the why. So for both of you, and I'll start with Jackie on this, then go to Sienna. Why is this conversation about diversity, equity, inclusion so important for organizations? Why is getting this right so critical? So Jackie, let's start with you.
Sure, Dan, happy to start. I'd really like to start with level setting a little bit on diversity, equity, and inclusion, because often people say the term diversity, equity, and inclusion in one breath, right? But they're very different things. So diversity is about people, embracing different backgrounds, cultures, identities, abilities, experiences. So if any of you think that diversity does not apply to you, it absolutely does. If you think about your personality, your personal experiences, your family, every part of who you are brings a breadth of perspectives to how you think and how you work. And that's good for innovation, for creativity, for problem solving, but only if we leverage inclusion along with that diversity. And then inclusion is about participation. So to have an inclusive culture means that your team feels a sense of belonging and safety, and that they're really seen and their voices are heard. And then equity is about processes. So do you offer flexible work schedules? Do you offer parental leave rather than just, maternity leave for a birth mother? Are there intentional outreaches to underrepresented young professionals in your internship programs? With regard to how DEI ties specifically to business outcomes, I could reference a lot of studies, as I'm sure Sienna can as well, but I'm going to just hit you with one that makes the case. So organizations that leverage diversity, equity, and inclusion generate 19% more revenue through innovation. And that's because when you have different ideas in the room, different ways to think about things, different ways to problem solve, that leads to more innovation. And 19% is a lot. And here's where I talk just quickly about the what's in it for me principle, right? With people who think that DEI initiatives don't apply to them. What can your organization do with 19% more revenue? That's new lines of business that they need leaders for, right? It's promotions, raises, better benefits. Who doesn't want and need that? And I'll let Sienna take it from here.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you, Jackie. I love what you shared, and I just kind of want to continue around that and asking ourselves something that I talk about a lot with the clients that we work with is instead of thinking about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as something that goes in this corner or that has a specific budget or that maybe has a task force where everyone's putting additional time, effort, and energy, it's really thinking about it as like, how are we having that be a part of our company DNA, right? So asking ourselves, how are we really understanding what that looks, not just looks like on the outside, but like what that looks like in regards to saying, again, diversity can mean you might be an extrovert and I might be an introvert, but how am I making sure that my managers or leaders create space in meetings for all of us to have equal opportunity to share thoughts, right? And so I really just want to encourage everyone that it's not just checking off a box or setting quotas or trying to say we need to be more quote unquote diverse, but actually leaning into that and saying, how are we creating the most inclusive workplace where everyone can show up as their most authentic selves and feel like they have a space to thrive?
Thank you both, and I think it's so powerful to start with the definitions too. And I love the broadening of the diversity definition because sometimes it does feel like it's more narrow, but the diversity of thought. I mean, that's powerful. And I'd like to stick with that thread on just the idea that some of the first things that happen seem to be that when companies, organizations look at this, they say, we'll have a DE&I program, but if it is really going to be integrated into DNA, then there needs to be a way to track progress. There needs to be a way to measure performance. And so I'd love to get your take, Jackie, on what it makes sense to measure when it comes to DE&I, what organizations might stay away from, and then any of the must-haves when it comes to assessing progress, because I think it could be a lot of different things that are looking at from a metric standpoint.
Absolutely, Dan. This is a great question. And successful measurement can be the difference between a successful initiative and one that loses steam and fizzles out. I think it was Peter Drucker that said, if you can't measure it, you can't change it, right? And sometimes what you think is happening as a leader isn't the perspective of your employees. And I've worked with many organizations around their DEI initiatives. And as part of that, we conduct listening sessions throughout the organizations. And sometimes it's astonishing the perceived sentiment of leadership versus the sentiment of the employees. And you have to start with benchmarking. Where are you now? And being open to this information can sometimes be scary, right? You're not sure if you want that information, but I recommend bringing in an outside consultant or company for this. And the reason is because people are less honest with their HR rep or their manager, right? You want to have a true picture of the sentiment around your organization first, having a real understanding of your employees' concerns, their experiences, their expectations. That'll help you set goals for how you roll out your DEI initiatives. And again, each of the concepts, diversity, equity, and inclusion, are different, so you measure differently. So diversity can often be measured with surveys, but make sure those surveys are inclusive. I never want to see 2 options for gender, for example, right? Equity needs to be measured by reviewing your policies and procedures, and then measuring the sentiment about how those policies are serving your employees. And then you measure inclusion by talking to your employees, and you can get an idea through surveys. But for me and for the diversity movement, we hold listening sessions or focus groups so we can talk directly to employees, and that action in itself is inclusion. Also, knowing the right questions to ask is important, and you need to ask those same questions quarter over quarter to get a real picture of progress and forward movement. You want to give space for write-in additions to the questions that you ask. The most important thing, though, Dan, to remember is that you want to communicate why you want this information. You can't just start with, here's a survey, right? You have to communicate to your teams that you're starting this journey, what that means, what resources will be available to them, how it incorporates everyone, not just the people who look like me or look like Sienna, but how does this benefit people that look like you, Dan, right? And remember, with every question, ensure that there's a prefer not to disclose, right? Some people don't feel the psychological safety, especially early on in a DEI journey, to disclose things around gender identity or disability or neurodiversity or invisible illness. So you have to give that space not to disclose, but openness will grow over time.
Thank you so much for that, Jackie. That's really powerful. I love the splitting the different each one into a different performance measurement progress, and I just love the collaborative feel of that approach, because being in organizations, there are so many people at all levels who are passionate about it, but not everyone knows what to do or how to get involved. And so I love level setting at the beginning and saying, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing this. That's wonderful. Sienna, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I love it. I was like, Jackie covered it all. I was like, I love how we're very aligned on processes as well as like best ways moving forward. So we're good.
Fine. Okay, well, let me ask you a question. So I was honored to be able to attend a training on allyship hosted by Sienna. It was a really amazing session, and all the employees at DHI Group went through this. And I thought one of the most interesting components to me was the discussion on intersectionality. And so, Sienna, I was wondering if you could talk about what we mean when we say that, and then why that's such an important term for organizations and individuals to understand when putting together diversity, equity, inclusion as part of an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. So really, just to take a step back, intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, if my mind is not failing me right now. But essentially what it means is it's when you're part of 2 different marginalized groups and those 2 things intersect. For example, I happen to be Black and a woman. I can never choose to only be one of those things in the eyes of others, right? And so even when we think about how data is taken, how we position things and thinking about diversity, et cetera, a lot of the times it's, okay, well, if you're in this box of being a woman, or if you're in this box of being Black and or a person of color. And so intersectionality is really being able to understand that for a lot of individuals, these things overlap. Again, this only doesn't have to do with gender and ethnicity as well, this can also be, well, I might not necessarily be able-bodied, and I might have something, or I might struggle with mental health issues, right? And those two things are things that sometimes are not always easy to see, but understanding that when we think about these things, they affect people in different ways, right? And so going back to your question, and when we think about intersectionality and its importance, I think that it's really important to, when we're thinking about engaging with underrepresented groups in our companies, whether they are colleagues or employees that we work with, I think something that's really important to do is to like try to get a full picture of understanding what the experience is like, and then also realizing that everyone's experience is going to be different, right? And so really trying to be a champion for individuals and people who are at the intersection of different parts that we're looking at, and like actually being able to ask ourselves, okay, well, when we lead into this, how can we champion and realize that you might be dealing with struggles on various levels that other individuals might not be if they only had to focus on a specific thing. I was just having a conversation around feminism, right? Or when we think about women in the workplace. And a lot of the times we can see that when we think about women in the workplace, that normally centers around a conversation of a specific type of woman, specifically white women. And so asking ourselves, how are we intentionally leaning a little bit more to be able to understand the nuances of what that looks like for individuals who are, or who are intersectional?
Thank you so much for that. And it reminds me of what you shared about inclusivity and the, one of the challenges of not unintentionally marginalizing another group while you're trying to put some of these programs in place. I think accessibility is something that is a great example of something that not everyone thinks about. And so it's just making sure you have the whole picture. I love that. So one question I want to ask, go ahead.
No, it's okay, Dan. I was just going to add on to that, and going back to what Jackie was saying as well. I think something that's really important for us to think about is how are we also creating psychological safety so that people feel open enough to talk about these things in the workplace, even if it can't be seen. And so just kind of something that I would love for us to lean in on, whether you're watching from home, well, you are watching from home most likely, but to really ask ourselves, how can we create a psychologically safe space so that if individuals are struggling with certain things, they feel open enough to be able to talk about it with you.
That's a great term. Thank you for bringing that up as well. Psychological safety is excellent. So one thing I wanted to ask both of you to get your excellent perspectives on is, so I feel lucky to have both of you as panelists because you're both in the diversity and inclusion, equity and inclusion consulting space, and so organizations who can help other organizations with these type of questions that we're asking. These are sensitive, difficult questions. I was wondering if you could both share, and we'll start with Jackie, on some of the trends you're seeing that have surprised you. I think there's the standard sort of list of here's the basics of what an organization needs to look at, but then what are some things that are maybe less widely known in terms of either challenges or barriers that you're seeing with organizations that are worth putting on the list when we're thinking about these types of things?
Yeah, Dan, so from my perspective, one challenge is that a lot of companies are jumping in on the ideal of DEI, that it's the new shiny thing, right? Even though it's not new, especially with the events of the last year, and not realizing the work and the ongoing commitment that is required to be successful. It's hard to shift your culture and change your language and develop new habits, but we all have to get there because of the benefits to the sustainability of our business. So there are a few questions that I ask when I get a question like this. The first one is, what is your leadership commitment to DEI, right? And the second is, are you ready to train your organization in this change management process, especially those middle managers who drive your culture? A lot of times your C-suite gets all of the attention and all of the consulting, but that middle manager line those are the ones that are driving your culture with your individual contributors. And then 3, how are you measuring? You have to commit to all 3 of those things to be successful. But again, I think the trend is that we need DEI. What does that mean? But really understanding that it's hard work, that it takes a real commitment, and that it's a journey is what the realization is. once they get past that initial, desire for DEI work.
And the change management implication of that, we use change management to focus on to put into place big other cultural shifts. So wouldn't we use the same for diversity, equity, and inclusion instead of treating it as something fully different? That's really interesting and I think powerful. So Sienna, I'd love to give you a chance to add on to that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I definitely agree. And I think the one thing that I would add is the snapshot of intentionality and impact, right? And I think that this is something that's huge because there are a lot of companies who have great intention, who want to start, who want to try doing things, but what they really lack at the core of it is knowledge and expertise on how to do so, capacity and bandwidth to actually be able to execute, and a clear strategy to actually be able to help them move forward. And so something that we do quite often on the PowerToFly team as we are consulting is we see companies who take a lot of baby steps to move forward and then have to go back and redo the work that they've done over the past 5, 6, 7 months because they realize they wanted to try and do it on their own, but realize that they can't, which again is okay because that sense of awareness is what we need to take action and then have accountability. But also when thinking about intention over impact, there's some really great stats out there that show companies and or individuals who think that they're doing something that's great, but when you actually look at the groups that they're trying to uplift or support, they're not necessarily noticing that in the same way, right? And this goes back to what Jackie was saying around like the conversations that you might have with managers or C-suite and the other employees that are saying, hey, we still need to really bridge the gap. And so one of the biggest challenges that we see quite often is like that intentionality versus impact, and then working to figure out how can we bridge the gap to actually be able to have it become a part of the company culture. Because again, at the end of the day, we're saying diversity, equity, and inclusion, but really it just means like, how are we focusing on our people? How are we focusing on our culture? How are we focusing on our external community as well to really be as inclusive as possible?
Thank you for that. And one of the things you mentioned there is we saw that in the report from both from Black respondents and then on the gender side from women respondents of that not being extremely happy with their organization's push towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it comes to your point of are these programs making an impact on the people who they need to most impact? So it's a great point. So I want to stay with one of the threads that you were talking about in terms of the organizations being at many different levels of progress here. I think there are some at the very starting line, and there are some who have gone through, like you said, maybe taken 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or the opposite of that. But I saw Chipotle announce that they're tying executive compensation to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I have more data on how they're doing that. But can you share what you've seen and how organizations are big or small, depending on who you've worked with, how they're looking at staffing up for diversity, equity, and inclusion from an internal perspective? Could it be hiring consultants, forming committees, hiring staff, or all of the above? So question for you, Jackie, on any of your thoughts on how to strategically approach that?
Yeah, of course, Dan. So, successful DEI initiatives can't be siloed initiatives. It can't be an annual program, right? Successful DEI initiatives are infused throughout the organization. And if we simply think about the word infused, it means to fill, to pervade, to permeate. So it has to be part of how you think about your culture, how you think about recruiting, your policies, how you run your meetings, how your work days are organized, right? DEI is simply a business leadership competency like anything else. So it should be tied to comp and reviews. You have to measure how you're doing. And those executives, directors, and middle managers are the ones that are driving the culture and standards throughout your organization. So we're seeing an emergence of DEI hires and employee resource groups. We're also seeing a lot of people, hanging their shingles to train you on this change. You have to make sure that you're hiring practitioners and working with consultants that have proven expertise in the realm. You want to be wary of people that come into your organization with a one-size-fits-all plan. For example, I mentioned before, we do listening sessions and surveys and interviews to really get an understanding of an organization's culture before we build out a customized plan for their business. And as with any major change, you want to over communicate the reasons why this matters to your organization, why it matters to your employees, all of them, right? And you want to understand your budget and your real commitment to this work. You know, don't just jump in, as Sienna said, with good intentions and then under deliver. And then finally, frankly, as leaders, you have to lead, right? Your employees are watching you and waiting for you to show in your actions if this is important to your organization or not.
I love that. And you use the word competency, which I think is a perfect assessment of, you're talking about the silos, but competency, that ties into, you know, how any business leader or person in a business, you know, should be evaluated. So I love that. Sienna, did you have anything to add on to that?
No, Jackie is rocking it. We're good. I was like, we can move on to the next question.
Yeah.
I agree 100%.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure give you a chance to jump in on those, and Jackie, vice versa on Sienna's, because I love the discussion. So Sienna, let me ask you this: what if, in keeping with the same thread about the people element of this, which of course is probably the biggest, what are the most important things that those with power and privilege in an organization, so it'd probably be a leadership level, what can they do in the professional environment to promote equality, and then at the same level discourage discrimination?
Absolutely. The first thing that I would say is, when we're thinking about being an ally because you have power and privilege, and that does not matter what you look like, right? And that can be whether you're an ally because you've been at the company for a long amount of time, because you're in a leadership position, etc. Something that I would really recommend are three things, right? The first one is getting to know your people, which sounds so silly, but a lot of the times when you have increased responsibility, when your days are full, it's a lot harder to take the time to actually know who you have in the room, right? And so once you actually take an effort to do that, then you can start hearing and championing for other individuals. And like, this is something I think that is so huge with allyship, is being able to say, how are we getting different people in the room than what we're used to? And really navigating our biases of saying, okay, well, instead of just having affinity biases of people who are like us or things that we share with, giving and really leaning in to be able to give opportunities to other people who you might not necessarily consider. The second thing that I would say is, again, how are we making sure that we're creating a culture of psychological safety? And I say this because when we take the time and effort and energy to create a sense of psychological safety, it allows for us to actually show up as allies. And I want to share a story really quickly of something that happened towards the beginning of January with what had happened in the Capitol. And there were two things that happened, where one, on the senior leadership team at PowerToFly, I'm the only woman of color on the leadership team, which is perfectly fine. But I remember we were having a hard conversation, or we were having a conversation around it. And I remember getting very vulnerable, right? And that's something that we try not to do in the workplace. We say, okay, well, I'm the only Black woman in the room. We're talking about race. I don't want to start crying or having emotions because we're supposed to be seen as strong or having it together, etc. And what I realized is that me being human as a leader in a company allowed for the other woman in the room to realize that this might have an impact on myself and other people who are like me than they might have necessarily realized, right? So having that sense of like leaning in and being vulnerable, and then also extending that to your teams, right? So checking in with them, saying, hey, do you need to take a moment? Do you need to take a beat? But also like fostering this not just in hard moments, but asking yourself, like, if I offer that to them, would they feel comfortable enough to actually say yes if they need it, right? And so just really leaning in. And to kind of go back to finish the question, the last thing that I would really say is just openly sharing different opportunities and not just having the conversations behind closed doors. Because a lot of the times there are people who might be interested in new opportunities or who might be more than capable, but if they're not in your immediate quote unquote network in the company, you might not necessarily think of them first. So when thinking about promotions, really asking and seeing how you can expand that than what you're used to. But again, it's going to take, when we think about inclusive leadership, it does take a lot of leaning in that might feel like hard work or might feel like something different. But when you're thinking about it, it's really being able to say, how are we creating an even better company so that everyone can thrive?
Love that. Thank you, Sienna. And I'll follow up, I guess, with you on this. One question we received internally while we were working on the, this webinar, and there's a lot of internal excitement about this to have the two of you here, is how about for everybody else? Because I think there's the generally accepted principle that it has to trickle down from leadership. There has to be the commitment, but then what about at the employee level? What can they do to be part of driving change?
Yeah, I love this. Something that I would recommend, and just like quick, easy things that we can do: create space for others to shine, which sounds so silly, but creating space for others to shine. So for example, if you're the only person who normally, or there's only a certain type of people who speak in meetings or who have a chance to share their voice, take a step back or highlight someone or say, hey, I heard that Jackie hasn't spoken a lot. Do you have something you want to share? Really just doing small things like that, or celebrating someone in a Slack channel, right? Hey, Belinda just did great work on this project, so that it shows and like highlights the work that other people are doing. And again, those are just very seemingly easy things, but I think things that really make a long-term difference. And the last thing that I was going to say is actively calling stuff out when you see it, right? And I think that that's something that's so strong that we can do as colleagues, of being able to say, if we're in a meeting and people are saying, hey guys, how do we call that out to realize, let's normalize not saying guys when we're not all male identifying in the room, which is something that's so small. But the more these small things happen, that's how culture starts to change from all levels. And I'll pass it over to Jackie if there's anything you want to share.
Sienna, you really hit it. The only thing that I would add, just to reiterate what you've already said, is that everyone has some level of privilege, right? How are you using your time and your resources to provide opportunity and access to someone else? How are you using that privilege for good? But that's the only thing that I would just reiterate from what you said.
Awesome. Love it. Thank you. Thank you both. So Jackie, to you, we've talked a little bit about unconscious bias here, but I'd love to hear your thoughts and insights on the way that leaders and employees can help mitigate unconscious bias in hiring and in the workplace in general.
Yeah. So you have to remember that unconscious bias is unconscious, right? That means it can be in direct contradiction to what we consciously believe and advocate for. And I'll give you a personal example. I was recently speaking at a virtual conference, and I joined to listen into the panel segment before mine. And there was a young woman who looked to be in her early 20s with a young hairstyle, and my instinct was, oh, that's cool to have someone so young, right? But really, I was making an assumption about her credibility and contribution because of her age. Now, every day I talk about Gen Z and their impact. But in that split second, I made a decision about someone with no information, right? Now, here's the catch. Everything that came out of her mouth was amazing. It was noteworthy. Everything she said had power in it. But in the 2 seconds before my conscious mind caught up with my unconscious mind, right, I made an assumption. And here's the thing. All of us have unconscious bias. Our brains process information at a speed faster than we even understand. So Dan, I love that you use the word mitigate rather than eliminate, because we have to be in conscious conversations with ourselves and interrogate our own assumptions. There are few places spotlit as well as our hiring practices for unconscious bias, for example. From writing the job description, right? White men apply to jobs they feel about 60% qualified for, whereas women and culturally diverse employees need to feel about 90% qualified, right? To scanning resumes, so you have to think about name bias, location bias, school bias, whether that's positive or negative. And then you have to think about your interview process, right? Have we ever spent half of an interview with someone who has a similar hobby or went to our alma mater, and after talking with them, you think, oh, they're great, but you have no real idea if they can do the job, right? So standardized questions can help when you're comparing skill sets first, candidate to candidate, And then be organic with the conversation, but make sure you're asking those same set of questions, and then broaden your interview team, right? The best way to mitigate your own bias is to ask yourself 3 questions. So when you're broadening your interview team, you're combating it that way, but also you can ask yourself 3 questions, right? To manage your own bias. Do I have an automatic feeling or reaction about this person? Is this person triggering something in my background, right? Does this person remind me of someone? So if you're consciously thinking about these questions to make sure that you're comparing people based on their merits, based on what they've been able to accomplish, you'll be in much better shape. And to Sienna's point earlier, you also need to speak up in the room, right? When you hear bias or hear assumptions from someone else. And then there are 3 questions that you can ask others to check their bias in the moment, but without being confrontational, right? So simple questions like, well, what does that mean, right? Or what makes you say that? Or why do you feel that way? Again, people are processing information and speaking quickly without really taking time to think through what they might be saying or what they might be assuming. But if you make them slow down, right, and by asking one of those 3 questions, you can check their bias in the moment. And that, again, to Sienna's point, helps you be a better ally.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And so we're close to time here, so I kind of wanted to move to sort of a final thoughts from both of you, starting with Sienna. Anything that you wanted to add to what the great content that we've already heard from you about, or just anything you would like to close with? So starting with you, Sienna.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dan. And also, it's just been an honor to be a part of this with both of you. I appreciate it. Something that I want you all to think about, or something that I would love for you to take away, is really simple, 3 words, right? Awareness, action, and accountability. So when thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, when thinking about allyship, when thinking about mitigating our biases, conscious or unconscious, the first step is awareness. So realizing that we have biases, that we have power, we have privilege, we can do better, we can lean in more. Having that awareness and then actually taking action. And then with that, keeping yourself accountable and others around you as well. So with those 3 things, awareness, action, and accountability, those are good first steps to lean in to really be able to spark change.
Thank you so much, Sienna. And to you, Jackie.
Sure. Sienna, I loved what you said, and I'll just echo that. I'd like to start by just saying being authentic is so important as you begin this journey. You want to educate your leaders so that they understand the benefits of DEI work. Talk to your company through surveys and focus groups. Find out where the gaps are, then make your plan, execute against your plan, evaluate your plan, regroup, and go again. With every step, you want to make sure that you're communicating internally and externally. Tell your employees what you're doing and why. Share your learnings, celebrate your victories externally, even the small ones. Then evaluate, regroup, and go again. It's a journey with no finish line, but the benefits are substantial. And you're going to have to get there for sustainable business because our world is becoming more and more diverse, and the people that we're leading are more diverse. The people that we're marketing to are more diverse. So we've got to do this work if we want sustainable business.
Thank you, Jackie. We're almost at time here. It's been my great honor to be here with both of you today, and I want to thank both of you for sharing your time and your insights with us, and then thank you to all who attended today's webinar for being here, spending the time with us today. We, as noted, will be providing answers to additional questions we received via the blog, and you'll receive the webinar recording in your inbox. And if you have any other questions about the report or the webinar, what we discussed today, please reach out to us at dice.com. And with that, we'll end today's webinar. So thank you all so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.